Let's go beyond the connection. Welcome to the podcast. I'm Steve McDonald, your host, and today we've got Erich Gazaui on. Eric, you're a Chief Information Officer at Papa, and I'm going to let you explain a little bit about the company and what you do. But we're going to be talking about today the importance of intelligence architecture. And how do we take the data? How do we take the intelligence that lives and resides in all kinds of different places and different technology, different departments? And how do we bring that all together so that the right decisions are being made at the right time so that we can intelligently grow our business? You're going to make the distinction, 10 years ago or more, it was all about digital transformation, and now AI is in the mix. And so there's a lot of evolution that's happened in terms of being a CIO and thinking about the intelligence architecture of the business. And we're going to get into that big time. But what I loved is we were just talking for a long time here that you've got a wife and two boys and you live in the San Diego area, and it's a phenomenal place to live. You're passionate about the outdoors in San Diego. Everyone is. That's one of the reasons why you live there. But you're also a passionate cook, and you've even put up websites with all of your recipes and everything. Here's what I'd love to do. Before we jump in, I'd love to just give you an opportunity to explain a little bit more professionally and personally about your background before we get started.
Sure, happy to. Thank you for having me, by the way. I've spent a large part of my career, certainly after joining the startup world years ago, in a very similar role. So internal, sometimes called IT operations, really focused on service management and internal stakeholders and their needs. And I've watched how the role has grown in need and importance in parallel to my career growing and being able to be part of the broader management group at the company, leadership, ultimately executive team that really helps shape the direction and frankly, the how that the goals or otherwise mission will be accomplished at the company level. So for me, it's very rewarding to have opportunities to be parts of those conversations and really helping the entity or really peers and other groups that I'm involved with elevate the role of the CIO and distinguish it from other roles in the company. Sometimes those roles can be conflated, but I would say generally speaking, this role has transformed. You mentioned transformation into a more partnership of the leadership. So whether that be the CEO or the president or even the board, the CIO plays a very business-minded partnership style of role. On the personal side, as you mentioned, those are some of the things I love to do. I spent a lot of time here in this city, actually, since I came to college here, and it grows on me all the time. There's new things to do. There's new restaurants, new parks, new construction, everything that's taking place around us that I view as progress. There's always challenges associated with growth, but when I look at the broad picture here in this city, we have a great deal of focus on what it means to be part of the city. And that's how I look at myself and look at my family. We're part of this city and want to be part of how it grows and improves, and also how we can enjoy being here in this sunny city.
It's a philosophy that transitions over into the business. I mean, you even talked about how being a part of the community, being a part of that culture. You talked about how there are team members you have on your team that have been with you at a number of different companies. And that culture and the environment that we create for our employees is why they interview us as much as we interview them when we bring them onto our team. And we don't want transition and turnover and churn on our team. We want people that are happy and productive and high performers, and that translates into business performance. So I love the philosophy overall. What I want to do is I want to focus now on, you mentioned how you partner with the rest of the C-suite, and that hasn't always been the case, right? CIOs have been in a position of kind of a support function in a lot of ways and haven't earned that seat at the table. That really is what a different way to kind of characterize what you're talking about here. You, in our last conversation, talked about how it's moving from support to care enablers. The experience of care that is being provided by the company is directly related to the information, the architecture, the access that you provide. How would you describe that movement, that role from kind of a support function to having a seat at the table and impacting the experience and the care provided?
I think it focuses on the difference between a system and the information in the system. And that also then speaks to how the system is used. I'll often tell leaders, CEOs or otherwise, hey, I'll stand up, build, design, or integrate any system that you like. But if we fail to use it correctly, it is often worse than having no system at all. And that understanding and the kind of material impact that accurate information, access to it, knowledge that exists in the first place, what that means to the company, I think is actually what has changed, which refocuses a role like mine at the forefront, because a support role, which is, as you mentioned, a little bit more traditional, certainly historically, is assuming that what is in place is functioning correctly, is designed correctly. And when support is needed is because something along those lines has failed or broken. But in that scenario, there's very little room for the idea that there's a need for improvement or advancement or growth or understanding new technologies that could be brought to bear in an organization. And so that disconnection historically has led to the role being underappreciated or underserviced. Today, when I think about how that's changed and to the point you're making, I look at it as when organizations understand that putting information in a spreadsheet, for example, is a really great first step or first start. But leaving it there can lead to disparate sets of information or aging of the information itself. But what ends up happening is by the time you're learning that that is happening in the sheets, you've built processes around those sheets, around that information, which becomes stale. And that leads to assumptions that are often flawed to some extent, maybe only a little, or in some more extreme cases, maybe the entire assumption is flawed, which then leads to flawed business decisions. So having a person who sits in a seat, in a role that's designed around the idea of ensuring that access to the information, which again is a pretty traditional IT style role, access to the information, but advocacy for the information and for self-service of it can change and ultimately drive a cultural shift in how that information is maintained. And hopefully will lead to feeding back into an organization like mine to say, we want this better, we want more, we want these tools. And that's when you know you're really in a good place. Your customers, I call them customers or my internal stakeholders, when they're coming and asking for something along those lines, you're really in a good place. You know, you've got them a captive audience, so to speak, and it gives you almost a self-creating roadmap. When you have all this requests coming in and everybody wants to see, especially today, you mentioned earlier, AI, certainly the buzzword, what that can do, how that can enable or increase efficiency or output, I think is the question on everybody's mind. Likely, yes. Timing wise, I think we could debate all day. The lift to do it and then the output, those are all debatable. But I think the binary question on whether or not that's going to have an impact, I think is clearly yes. But when it comes to that role transitioning and ensuring that you have the DNA, the charter of an organization like mine to play a role, then at the leadership level, you have a seat and it becomes more than just available to you, to me, it becomes a mandate. We need to have this role. We need to have this thought process at the table with the rest of the thought processes so that we together, the outcome is ideally better.
So, having a role at the table almost in business has 100% of the time one really important requisite amongst a number, which is how does what you do impact the bottom line? That's the way your CFO, your CEO, the board, like everybody's going to put it through a filter, right?
I have a bit of an advantage, so we'll start there. In my current company, as well as several previous, I run company-wide procurement. So that gives me great visibility. And I would say that's the number one takeaway from that part of this conversation is that the visibility, the span, the angle of my lens of the company is very wide. You might say that if you combine that with the more traditional IT functions and then enterprise apps type functions, so building in enterprise class systems, integrating those pockets give such visibility that to answer the question, how do you drive a return, cost, or revenue? I have those levers I can pull. So certainly on the procurement side, I can negotiate for better aligned commercials with engagements. I can also ensure that system overlap, underutilization, those things are spotted fairly quickly, which then leads to ideally you're driving higher utilization and adoption of systems that have been brought into the company. Someone somewhere thought this was the right thing to do. Likely that is broader than just a single person. So making sure that you have that visibility means that you can drive that adoption and get the output or the return that the company expected on the system. So I would say that those are a couple of the bullet point answers to your question. On the procurement side, that's me having a leg up or an advantage, so to speak. But even in a more traditional IT sense, understanding the systems in place, how they're used by the company, whether or not there's opportunity for reduction or consolidation, which certainly will lead to cost savings. But anyone who knows me, and I say this often, it is absolutely not the number one reason why I drive to things like consolidation. It's not cost savings. That's a very happy side effect. You could even call it the second highest priority. But the number one is reducing disparity in process, improving access to information, and ensuring the information itself is accurate and driving the kind of outcomes that everybody expects, or enabling the work that people are doing. So when you look at that and you look at a role like mine, that approach, that one pillar alone really drives a return concept, whether it's on the dollars spent on a system or human dollars for capital on processes or projects. There's a lot there. And then, of course, I have the procurement side to help balance that. But in the broad stroke answer, I would say often when a CFO will look toward groups like mine and say, help me understand the return or the cost structure, or how do we benefit, or how do we do mapping, especially more traditional, older thinking around mapping headcount. So how many people in the support function do you need versus how many people are in the company? When you look at that, you really look at opportunities for engagement. And those touch points can drive the types of engagement. Today, automation is the word I prefer to use. Before I would say AI, but it's a spectrum now, right? You get all the way to one side of the spectrum, you'll end up in AI land. But all of those concepts that have been tried and true really start to stand out when what you're looking to automate is information movement. Any small business has these challenges where you have people whose job it is to move information from one system to another, or worse, from one spreadsheet to another, or even from one Slack channel to another, if you will. Those functions are largely built around the idea that there isn't another way to do that movement or that transform. And there is. And so those are the three kind of pillars that I would answer that question with. Procurement being perhaps a little less common for a CIO, but I certainly enjoy it. Have the return around system adoption and utilization. And then you have the kind of realization or the information sharing and awareness at the C-suite that those functions, those paths are actually attainable. First of all, they're there. Let's start awareness. And then they're attainable really for any size company when you have a person in a seat in a role like mine that understands that picture and can really drive. And when you take those three all together, and I have great relationships with the heads of finance at all the companies I've been at for all those reasons. And they look for those opportunities. And often what will happen is they grow to expect them. And that's a good place to be, frankly.
You know, as I'm listening to you, a CIO has to be good at speaking information architecture, information technology, finance, internal customer needs. You know, in a healthcare organization, the end care, the patient, ultimately who you're servicing here. So what I'm taking away in total is you have to understand not only just the business and finance, but you have to understand how, as a business, we serve your constituency, internal and external. If you're not understanding that, then you're not understanding how the information architecture needs to flow and how it needs to serve and what's the priority and what's not. So I don't know if you would say the same way, but one of my big takeaways is you got to talk the language of all the different departments and the end users all at once.
I like how you said it. I sometimes will say something similar, that I can speak fluent, enter the word finance, people and culture. I think that if you were to talk to peers, they would agree that I have a knack for it. I've certainly experienced similar realities. The two teams we mentioned there are very similar in sense of urgency, in reactivity, in who they serve. We're all serving, generally speaking, internal stakeholders, internal employees or otherwise. So there's a lot of camaraderie that gets built around those interactions, but the ability to speak those languages certainly developed over time. And I would say that, is it a requirement? Probably. As you get more senior, that's going to get embedded. It'll be there. But I would say for starting in a career or as you work your way through your career, it becomes an asset. And you'll notice the response when you can speak their language. You'll see a change. And that's especially true in finance. Sometimes I'm called an honorary member of the finance team for various degrees. But when you can speak actual gap or forecast based language and understand cost of revenue and how that plays a role in the various things that I would do, whether it becomes the type of system we're buying, why we're buying it, and how that would ultimately get classified in the books, plays a role. And it really is instrumental from the finance point of view, because then they can capture it correctly and perhaps even advantageously to the company based on that knowledge. So having those touch points, I think, with the groups is very helpful.
It's interesting because one of the number one challenges in business that C-suite executives talk about all the time is internal alignment. And if you don't understand the different departments, it's really hard to have alignment and serve them. They need to understand what you do. You need to understand what they do. And it's that lack of understanding and different KPIs and objectives that we all have that create friction between the different departments. And what you're talking about is creating the ultimate loss of friction. That's kind of the way I'm thinking about it. So I wouldn't be doing my due diligence as a host if I didn't ask the CIO about AI readiness and the pressure on that, because I know you're getting that question from all sides all the time, and how you're enabling it, what is it going to do, when we're going to have it, all the questions, because we all bequeath this is going to fundamentally change our business. We don't even have to understand why. We already think that's going to be the case. So what is the AI readiness pressure in your business, and how do you handle that?
There are a few different ways to think about it. One is there is a conversation, I think we'll use that word, about can AI technology play a role in delivery of the service itself? While I'm part of that conversation, ultimately the answer is going to be driven by the product and engineering teams, which is a different department. And they're going to drive to where the technology can be brought to bear to interact with our constituents. In this company's case, those are members of health plans. So it's a slight difference than a direct relationship with a customer. We think of them, of course, as customers, but they're members, and we take special attention when it comes to distinguishing that idea. But then on the other side of the house, which is my responsibility, how do we use tools like that to enable all of the promise of what is out there in the space? There are many, many leaders, several of them who have been working on these for decades. These technologies, the theories behind them, the concepts, the policies, the politics, all of it. So you'll probably have noticed the theme out there. There's several. One of them certainly safety from every level. In our space in healthcare, that safety is paramount. So when it comes to what's external facing, there's a very healthy and necessary hesitation, or at least desire to move slowly and understand. Internally, I would say there's a similar notion. It's just a little easier to deploy, especially at a smaller company, where you can have your hands on it a little closer, ensure people understand what it is, how to use it, when to use it, and what to be careful of. And it ties very closely for me to one of my other responsibilities, security, and making sure people understand when technology like that is being used on them, even by legitimate desire to interact. Certainly that spectrum can roll all the way into the bad actors for nefarious purposes. So that kind of span means the need for that understanding has grown. And over time, the need for everyone to understand basic security has grown, as has the definition of basic security. Years ago, basic security was don't write your password down on a piece of paper. Don't do that. But today, basic security has grown, I would say, tremendously. Even best practices could include things like, I'll use a small example, almost a silly one, where you would pay attention to the app that you're downloading from the App Store, look for reviews, look for the publisher of the app, look for any other aspects that could help you understand whether or not this is quote unquote legitimate or otherwise okay to download. That thinking has grown exponentially. So when it comes to AI or AI enabled technology, it's the same need, but it's just moving so much quicker because the technology has enabled growth in areas that become either effective at driving efficiency or otherwise growth and gain, as well as surface area for attack and other aspects that would be considered negative. So that volume and velocity together present a very real challenge. So CIOs, I belong to a couple different peer groups, and it dominates the conversation. And every time we get together, some different aspect of AI this, AI that. And I think what I would feel is present and what I think I like is that generally speaking, everyone is accepting it's here and it's coming, and we're just going to have to figure out how to deal with it, which I like. I'll give you a very, very short story as a contrast. I was in college, the internet that we know today was being born, and it was a very different reality that you would get with peers at the time, even people in my seat that I had yet to meet, more senior folks, et cetera, who were not necessarily on that page. They weren't necessarily saying, oh, the internet's coming, it's here, there's nothing we can do about it. I heard phrases, all sorts of things, including no one's ever going to bank online. I heard that from a VP of a very, very well done bank. Guy looked at me like I was a fool, and I thought, okay, maybe I'm wrong. I don't know. This seems pretty cool. So when you think about that and you think of the difference, I think there's a very noticeable change in how we look at technology coming. Some groups are, I think appropriately, pushing back, or at least pushing so that it can be a little slower. Some groups are all in and building businesses around it. And obviously there's businesses that are only just building those technologies. But I think the idea that it is a tool to be used, I think is healthy. I think it won't be very long, probably a single digit number of years, probably one hand worth of fingers of years before the tech is so deeply enabled and so embedded that we think of it today just like we think of the internet, which took probably closer to 20 years to get to that state, where we don't think of how the street light turns on at night. We don't think about the roads being paved. We stopped thinking about how a refrigerator works probably before I was even born. So those types of kind of transitional elements, I think, are taking place today. And it's going to get so embedded in all the big firms out there, the email providers, the chat providers, the enterprise system providers, especially the leaders, the big names. They're all enabling their own bots, their own agents within these platforms. At some point, it will be difficult to discern the difference between using the platform and then engaging with the agent. It will become almost fluid. And I think that transition can lead to a lot of very powerful gains. But one of my jobs, I mentioned security, but just general governance as a whole, I think needs to play a role. The smaller the company, the more balanced approach you need to take and ensure that innovation is free to grow and to drive, but with an eye to that. Certainly in our company, in my industry, that idea of regulation or governance is a foregone conclusion. So there's one fewer battle that I have to fight to try to explain this is real, we have to have it. So that's cool. But it's still a conversation that happens, and it's a balancing act. And what I tell people at the end of the day, my job is to find the path to yes. I will find that path. There may be twists and turns and hills to climb, but there's a path and we'll find it. And I know that there are different schools of thinking on that. Sometimes people will say there may not be a path, or they may start with a no. I think that's very challenging for any company, especially a small firm that is innovating. Innovation is a word used all the time, but when you're a small company, either creating a space, as this company did, or growing that space, innovation means you're likely pushing the limits or the boundaries. And you need to do that in order to drive to those gains. But if you do it with an eye toward, or at least a partner of governance, you're going to find yourself further down that path of success quicker, because you will have met certain milestones along the way as you innovate and as you push the envelope. And you won't have to double back and redo things when you learn that perhaps you stepped too far.
Eric, I've got one last question, and it's the most important one. We've covered so much territory here that if you could say there was one thing that you wanted other information architecture, technology professionals that are tuning in here that you wanted them to take away from our conversation, the one thing, what would it be?
Often, relationships between groups like mine and the rest of the company are service in nature. Certainly, there is that component, perhaps very large part. And the bigger the company, the more likely the groups like mine will be bigger and maybe distinguished, in other words, in their own department. The message I would say is, and what I did when I got to this company before, investing in those relationships, ensuring the bridges are built, that they're maintained, that they're healthy, just like any physical bridge in the world, and get to a place where the people that you work with, your colleagues, other teams, cross-functional members, what you want them to believe, and you want them to know it even more than believing, is that we're here to help. We're here to enable. If you can reach that state and prove, what you'll find is that the people who are asking you for participation or support or anything, really what you want them saying in their heads as they're asking is, isn't it so cool we get to work with those folks over there? Because often what will happen is you come to a company and usually the sentiment is different. Sometimes even the opposite, like, oh, I have to work with those people, or I have to go through this, or I have to go through that. And that's a losing battle. So that's the piece. And I spent a lot of time correcting that direction, the culture, the bridges, as I mentioned, getting to a place where almost excitement that, wow, we get to work with them on this. Because why be excited? Well, they have access to this. They know how to do that. They can quickly move on this. They can stand up POCs and all these other things and quickly put something in front of somebody's screen that gives that person instant feedback so that they know, oh, wow, my thought that I could do X, Y, and Z, that actually could work. I'm going to keep pushing on that. But without that sentiment, the person feeling that way is going to seek that feedback somewhere. They're going to get that. And that might mean that they spend way more time than necessary to accomplish it, or worse. The phrase we all know all too well, the idea of shadow IT, exists. And that's often where it's born from, where they want to just go around the team because it's too big of a blocker, or it takes too long, or they're maybe just misunderstandings, which I know to be the case. So that's the message I would say, if people can believe it. So certainly any leader in a similar seat to mine, take that for what it's worth. But also anyone else on the other side of the requester side, I would say the same thing. Just imagine, just take a step back and change that vernacular, change how you think, and just say it just one time. I am so grateful that I get to work with that group. And let's see what happens. Watch how the group responds. And then all of a sudden, in a matter of just really moments, you'll be best buds and you'll be flying together. And the next time you need to do something, it'll be a quick message in a chat program that says XYZ. And the response is going to be so quick. Like, oh, I knew it. I can do this. I'm going to go here. I'm going to do that. Ultimately, that just drives so much. And it gives that instant response, or at least very, very timely response, and allows for better decisions, faster decisions, and ultimately better outcomes.
Well, I wish we had another hour. There's so much we could cover here, but you really painted a very, very vivid picture here. And information architecture, technology has been something in the past that has a stigma around it, that they're the no people. Like, we're going to get no a lot more than we get yeses, right? So just the can-do attitude, I think, is a really great takeaway. And, the mission of this podcast is to bring different executives together to share their perspectives so we can all learn. And that is one major takeaway I hope a whole bunch of people have from today, because that can literally transform internal cooperation and coordination and what the business can do. And all companies do well because they're full of high performers. It's people that make the big difference. And what you're doing is you're enabling what the people need to do. So I just wanted to say thank you for coming on and sharing those unique perspectives. If we all do that, I call it the rising tide that lifts all boats. And you were an amazing part of that rising tide today. So Eric, I just wanted to say thank you for coming on.
Thanks for having me. It's been great. And hopefully people walk away with one good piece of information. That's my hope.